Welcome back, folks, to part 3, our final part on the digestive system, where we're going to take a look at everything that happens from the start of the intestines to the anus. All right, don't worry, be stupid. There's only one reason why I have this up, and it has to do with the name of that cartoon dog. I don't know if you guys know him or not. But let's see if you do, if you pick it up in the next slide. All right, so to start off with the small intestines, which is the next part of the GI tract after the stomach, and take a look at its gross anatomy. It runs from the pyloric sphincter, where it meets the stomach, to the ileocecal valve, where it runs into the cecum, or the large intestine. And the last part of the small intestine is called the ileum, so that's why it's called ileocecal valve. It has 3 subdivisions: duodenum, which comes first right after the stomach, jejunum in the middle, and ileum at the end. The bile duct and the main pancreatic duct join at the duodenum, and they help with digestion of stuff in the duodenum, finishing off digestion. And they're controlled by the sphincter of Odie. Odie is the name of that dog from the Garfield cartoons. The ileum joins the large intestine at the ileocecal valve, like I said before. So let's take a look at this microscopic anatomy of the small intestine. And it's a little bit different from the duodenum top end to the bottom end, exactly what's going on, but it's basically the same, but a little differences. Structural modifications of the small intestine wall increase its surface area. Surface area is key because one of the major functions of the small intestine is absorption of all the nutrients. This is where the vast majority of absorption happens, is in the small intestine. Okay, so we want to increase surface area. So beyond the fact that the small intestines are just really long, small tubes wound all over the place to fit in there, that alone increases the surface area as opposed to just being a big sack like the stomach. Not nearly as much surface area. So we've got that long tube. In addition, within the lumen of the small intestine, you have these plicae circularis, which are kind of like deep folds of the mucosa and submucosa. Kind of reminds me of looking at like a ridged culvert, right? They've got those waves in them. That increases the surface area. On that, you have villi, which are like finger-like extensions. So rather than being smooth, they come up here, and now we have a ton more surface area with those villi. And on each of those villi, we have microscopic microvilli, which are like fingers on the fingers to help with absorption. So let's take a look here. So here we can see the long, thin tube of the small intestine increases surface area. And then where it's got it unwound, we can see in picture A, the plicae circularis makes it look real ridged, and you can see how that easily doubles, triples, quadruples the surface area. Then in picture B, the middle picture, we can see the villi, these little finger-like projections, and each one of those is filled with capillaries and blind and lymph capillary to absorb those nutrients. And it's a little misleading that they show up being blue and red blood in there. It's not oxygenated, deoxygenated. It's stuff that doesn't have nutrients and stuff that does have nutrients. Okay, and then on the far right, C, we've got the microvilli. So these are subcellular structures. They're on the surface of the cells here that increase the surface area even more. More surface area means more places where the nutrients can come in close contact with the blood and get absorbed via diffusion and osmosis for water. Histology of the wall of the small intestines. So the cells do have intestinal crypts, which secrete intestinal juices. We have Brunner's glands in the duodenum, the first part, which secrete an alkaline mucus. Why would the Brunner's glands be in the duodenum as opposed to the later two, the jejunum and the ileum? Exactly, because the chyme coming out of the stomach is going to be acidic, right? That's one of the triggers to get it to push into the small intestine, is that the acidity level has gotten where it needs to be. So it's lower pH. So when it gets to the duodenum, it's still pretty acidic, so you got to be able to protect from that. So that alkaline mucus counteracts that in the duodenum. The duodenum is mainly dealing with digestion, not absorption. So it's a little bit tougher walls. Those intestinal juices that are secreted by those glands, those are secreted in response to distension, so stretching of the intestine in that area, or irritation of the mucosa. Stuff's irritating it like acid. It will cause them to secrete some of those intestinal juices, which are slightly alkaline. They are isotonic with the blood plasma, so you don't like suck water out of the blood. And they're mainly water, not a lot of enzymes, not a lot of digestive function, but they do contain some of that mucus. Liver. Let's talk about the liver, because the liver produces something that secretes into the duodenum. The liver is the largest gland in the body. Superficially, it's got 4 lobes, kind of like the lung had a number of lobes that help it to flex without tearing. Something called the falciform ligament from the top of the liver to the bottom of the diaphragm helps keep the liver from kind of falling down and crushing the stomach. With the liver, we see hepatic blood vessels enter it. The gallbladder is in there. It's in a recess right up here. Bile, which the liver produces, can leave either through the gallbladder, in the common hepatic duct, which fuses with the cystic duct and goes into the small intestine. We'll have a picture of that in a minute. So here we go. So stomach would be right up here above the pancreas, this big yellow corn-looking thing. And then this tube is the duodenum. So it's not very long, it's just that first curve. And into that tube, besides having the Brunner's gland secreting the alkaline mucus, we also secrete some other digestive juices. From the liver, we get bile. Now, bile can come in through the right and left hepatic ducts all the time. But if you put it in the gallbladder, it concentrates that bile. And when you eat like really fatty meals, you can get a big old squirt of bile in there to help break down that fat, because that's what bile is for, breaking down fat. If you've had your gallbladder removed, one of the things you got to do with your diet is make sure you're not eating too much fat all at once. You can eat fat and oils, you need them. But if you eat too much at once, you can't digest them well because you can't get enough bile in there all at once to handle them because you only got the right and left hepatic ducts to take care of that. And here we can also see where it comes down in and connects up with the duct from the pancreas and goes in the duodenum. So what's in the bile? Lots of stuff. It's alkaline, it's got to help neutralize that acid from the stomach, bile salts, bile pigments, kind of greenish looking, cholesterol, neutral fats, electrolytes, phosphorus, all sorts of stuff in there. Basically, it's stuff to help neutralize the stomach acid and help finish that, or start and finish the chemical digestion of fats, emulsifying it, absorbing it, and solubilizing it. Okay, so just getting that fat into a form that we can absorb it into our bloodstream. That's what bile's job is. The gallbladder, like I said, green muscular sac, stores and concentrates the bile by absorbing its water, and then it will release that via the cystic duct, which flows into the bile duct and then into the duodenum. Now the pancreas lies kind of underneath the stomach and kind of in that curve of the duodenum we saw. It has excrement functions, meaning secreting stuff outside of the body, which in this case is the lumen of the duodenum, the small intestine. It secretes pancreatic juices, which break down all categories of foodstuffs. So remember, we did mechanical digestion in the mouth and the stomach. We started chemical digestion of starch in the stomach, or in the mouth, with salivary amylase. We continued that in the stomach, and then we added in chemical digestion of protein with hydrochloric acid and pepsin. And then when we get to the liver or the duodenum, we still haven't taken care of fats, and we haven't finished off starches and proteins yet either. So these pancreatic juices, along with the bile for fats, kind of finishes off that chemical digestion right there in the duodenum. Past the duodenum, there's not a ton of chemical digestion. A little bit, but most of the last bit of it takes place there. It neutralizes stomach acid. And the pancreas also has some endocrine functions, which we discussed at the first unit of the year when we talked about blood sugar regulation and the negative feedback loop, where we're talking about the release of insulin and glucagon. We're not going to tackle that in this unit because we've already covered that once. So digestion in the small intestine, what happens? So chyme enters the duodenum. Like I said, carbohydrates and proteins are only partially digested, but no fat digestion has taken place yet. So that digestion will continue as chyme is slowly released into the duodenum. Whatever substances we need, more bile, more pancreatic juices, whatever is detected, and we secrete what we need. And then past that in the jejunum and the ileum, that's where virtually all nutrient absorption takes place in the small intestine. So by the time food gets through the small intestine, pretty much all the nutrients you want other than water has been taken out and put into your blood. All we got left is a slurry of water to keep it moving and the indigestible stuff your body doesn't want. And that's what gets moved into the large intestine. So how do we move stuff in the small intestine, guys? Most common motion is segmentation, so that mixing. And that mixing does a couple things. One, and the duodenum helps to make sure all those digestive juices get mixed up with the food to help finish the digestion. But two, if you didn't do that, if you had like a tube and the food in the middle would never get close enough to the villi to get absorbed in the bloodstream, and we get all the way through and you wouldn't absorb it all. So by mixing it up, you make sure you're constantly pushing fresh nutrients to where the walls are, where they can become incorporated via diffusion. Okay, and most of those components steadily move toward the ileocecal valve and the cecum and the large intestine and mixes. After nutrients have been absorbed, if you want to move them a little more quickly, you do peristalsis and slide it on down into the large intestine. Basically, what's all moving into the large intestine is just meal remnants, leftovers, bacteria, mucosal cells, and debris from the small intestine and the stomach that would get moved into the large intestine. All right, let's move on to the last major organ of our digestive system, the large intestine. Some unique features of it. There's things called tenai coli, which are 3 bands of longitudinal smooth muscle that help to move food through the large intestine, and things called haustra, which are kind of like little pockets or sacs caused by the tenai coli kind of tensing up on the large intestine. And we can subdivide it into these 4 main parts: the cecum, or 5 main parts, sorry, the cecum, the appendix, the colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. The cecum lies inferior to the ileocecal valve, forms a little sac down there, and hanging off of that, we got the appendix, which we think is a evolutionary leftover, a vestigial organ or structure from an ancient ancestor that was more herbivorous, and the cecum helped to digest plant material. It does seem to have a number of lymph cells, so it may play a little bit of a role in our lymph system. But it doesn't seem to do much for us. Nobody suffers any issues when it gets taken out. Problem is, if bacteria gets in there and gets infected, it can burst and get bacteria into your peritoneum, and you get peritonitis, and that can be quite bad. And that's why people have to have their appendix taken out sometimes. So here we can see that diagram. So we can see the ileocecal valve coming in here and the ileum. Below that, we have the cecum, and hanging off of that, we have the little worm-looking thing, the veriform appendix. Then we have the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum and anus. And you can see those little pockets. Those are the haustra, and the muscle there is the tenai coli. So, like I said, 4 main regions: ascending, transverse, descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. And the sigmoid colon runs into the rectum. And the anal canal is the last segment of the large intestine, which opens to the exterior at the anus. So, I love the title of this slide. I don't know why, but I do. The valves and sphincters of the rectum and anus. It's that middle school, elementary boy in me, I guess, that likes that title. But the valves and sphincters of the rectum and anus. There are 3 valves of the rectum that stop feces from being passed with gas, these little flaps, so that you can squeeze out a little excess gas, but not hopefully squeeze out the poop. Though once in a while, some stuff does get by, as everybody probably knows, but doesn't want to admit. The anus also has 2 sphincters. The internal anal sphincter, which is composed of smooth muscle. So if it's composed of smooth muscle, do you have voluntary control over that sphincter? Right? No. Smooth muscle, you have no voluntary control over. It does what it wants to do. So the internal anal sphincter, you don't have control over. So it opens up when it wants to let poop out. You don't have any control. But you do have an external anal sphincter, which is a ring of muscle on the outside of that internal one, which is skeletal muscle. Now, skeletal muscle, do you have voluntary control over that? Yes, you can learn voluntary control over that, and that's how we're able to hold it. And these sphincters are closed except during defecation. In the anus and the rectum, we have anal sinuses, which exude mucus and compress the feces. So when it comes down, it's all kind of loose and, whatever. So it compresses it into a nice, for lack of a better term, log that we can then let out later. And in there, we have some superficial venous plexi, which is superficial aggregation of veins associated with the anal canal. Those can become irritated and inflamed, and that can result in what we call itchy varicosities, more commonly known as hormones, which are literally bulging vessels in the anal canal, or either inside or just on the outside of it. And we can see all this stuff in this picture. So up here we have one of those rectal valves we talked about that keeps the poop in but lets the gas out. We can see the anal sinuses here, which secrete the mucus and kind of compress the feces when it gets in there. We can see these blue hemorrhoidal veins, the ones that can become hemorrhoids, internal and external. There, we can see another one of the valves near the bottom at the anus. and we can see the internal anal sphincter, which is the smooth muscle you don't have control over, and the 3 bands of the external anal sphincter, which you do have control over because that's skeletal muscle. One other muscle to note is the levator ani muscle. This is the one when you pinch off at the end that kind of pulls everything up and in. When you do that, if you don't know what I'm talking about, next time you see a dog or a cat going poop, keep an eye on the anus and you'll see it kind of pucker up and come in. That is the levator ani muscle doing that. All right, so there's some bacterial flora, some bacteria living in our large intestine. It can be some bacteria that survives the small intestine that enter the cecum, and those entering via the anus. So it gets in from both directions. These bacteria colonize the colon, and they actually help us out. They have a symbiotic relationship with us because they help us digest indigestible carbohydrates. They ferment them. So there's a lot of carbohydrates, fibers, that we can't digest and get any nutrient value out of. These bacteria can, so we provide them with a place to live and food, and they break down those indigestible carbohydrates and release irritating acids and gases. Farts, the smelly parts of it at least. But they also synthesize E complex vitamins and vitamin K, which we need. So they're good for us, even though they got that side effect of the flatus. So what does the large intestine do? Other than digesting those bacteria that get in there, no further digestion really takes place. Vitamins, water, and electrolytes are reclaimed at this point. We don't want to reclaim them in the small intestine because we want to keep all that leftover stuff moving with a fairly fluid material, so it's easy to move through the intestines until we get right near the end. So we take all that stuff out at the end in the large intestine. So its major function is the propulsion of fecal material towards the anus. Though the colon is essential for comfort, it's not essential for life. People can have their colon removed. They have a harder time absorbing water and vitamins and things, so that's one issue. But they can live without it. They have to wear a colonoscopy bag, which collects the feces, which really aren't what we think of as feces because they haven't had all that water and stuff absorbed out of them yet, so they're very liquidy. But you can survive without it. Motility, and when we move it, 2 things. One, the presence of food in the stomach will activate the gastrocolic reflex. So gastro for stomach, colic for colon, and that will initiate peristalsis that forces contents towards the rectum, trying to make room for it. So you notice how sometimes after you eat a big meal, you'll feel the need to go to the restroom maybe an hour or 2 afterwards. That is a reflex response to the stomach being distended, and it's saying, oh, we got a lot of food coming in. Let's start moving stuff through these intestines if we got stuff that's been sitting in there for a while and get rid of it. So it moves that stuff down into the anus, where then you'll now feel the urge to poop it out, making room for all that new food you just took in. So, and that leads us to defecation, or the fancy word for pooping, or taking a dump, or other words you can think of. So when those rectal walls get distended by feces going into them, you'll get a reflex response that will contract the rectal walls to compress the feces and push them towards the anus. And it will relax the internal anal sphincter to let them down a little bit further. Okay, but then you get voluntary signals which stimulate the relaxation of the external anal sphincter, and then defecation occurs. But the pushing is actually involuntary. You just got to open that up and let it go. So here we can see in blue, we've got the sensors that are sensing the distension of the rectum going up to the spinal cord, and that initiates a reflex which causes the lower portion of the sigmoid colon and the rectum to contract, to push and compress the feces out. Well, the same sign, we have a inhibiting one that causes the internal anal sphincter to relax. And then we have another one coming all the way from the brain, which is going to open up those external anal sphincters, which allows the poop to come out. And that will do it for our unit on the digestive system, folks. Hope you've learned a lot. If you got questions, bring them to me in class, and I will see you later. Bye.